If there's one topic that divides Americans more than any other, it's probably the Vietnam War. Some people consider it America's greatest foreign policy disaster, while others think it was one of the best things America ever did. But regardless of what you think about the war itself, there's no denying that it was one of the most pivotal events in modern history. And it still has major ramifications today. So let's talk about it. Welcome to the channel. The year is 1963. John F. Kennedy has been assassinated and Lyndon B. Johnson is now president. The United States has been involved in the country of Vietnam since the 1950s, and they've already committed thousands of military personnel to fight in the conflict there. The U.S. sees this war as part of the larger battle against the spread of communism throughout Asia. You see, after World War II, many Asian colonies that had previously been ruled by European powers were suddenly free to govern themselves. Many of these new countries began to trend towards communism, which threatened to eventually surround the U.S. and its allies with communist nations. This was bad news for America because at this point in time, the Soviet Union and China were communist, and the U.S. wanted to prevent the spread of communism from reaching their southern border. Therefore, America decided to get involved in Vietnam. But why? I mean, the Vietnamese didn't ask for American help. So why would we go to war there? Well, the reason was kind of complicated. To keep this video simple, let me explain it like this. The big communist countries like China and the Soviet Union were arming and funding North Vietnam, and this made South Vietnam nervous. South Vietnam was worried that if North Vietnam got too powerful, then they might try to take over the entire country and turn it into a communist state. So South Vietnam asked America to intervene and help them out. Now, America didn't necessarily want to do this, but they also didn't want the dominoes of Asia to fall to communism. Therefore, they agreed to help South Vietnam. By 1964, America had sent around 200,000 military personnel to Vietnam to assist South Vietnam in their fight against the communists. While American troops were able to have some success against the Vietnamese communists, they soon realized that winning the war would be far more difficult than they had originally anticipated. See, the problem was that the American military was fighting against the Vietnamese people, and many Vietnamese people didn't like having foreigners tell them how to live their lives. As a result, many Vietnamese civilians became part of the Viet Cong, a group of communist guerrillas who would ambush and harass both American and South Vietnamese forces. The vast majority of these Viet Cong members were actually civilians who had little to no military training. But despite being untrained, they knew the jungle better than anyone else, and they used this knowledge to their advantage. Oftentimes, they would lure American troops deep into the jungle where they would then be ambushed by other Viet Cong soldiers. It didn't matter that American firepower was superior to the Viet Cong. In most cases, the Viet Cong had prepared too well, and the element of surprise was always on their side. This led to high casualties on the American side, and public opinion of the war turned sour. But even though the American public didn't want to fight in the war anymore, President Johnson refused to pull out. He believed that doing so would cause all of Asia to fall to communism, and he didn't want that to happen. So instead, he increased troop numbers to over 500,000 men. Unfortunately, this only led to more and more casualties and public dissent. In 1968, two major events occurred that caused the tides of the war to turn. First, in January of that year, 5,000 North Vietnamese soldiers attacked the city of Hue. This was bad news for South Vietnam because Hue was an important city, and it showed just how strong the North Vietnamese army really was. At the time, American officials told the public that the attack on Hue was being led by Viet Cong, not North Vietnam, but it soon became clear that this was false. In reality, it had been a full-blown attack by the North Vietnamese army. So when the dust had settled, 2,000 South Vietnamese soldiers and 2,000 civilians were dead. All the Americans could salvage was 300 weapons and ammunition. They had lost hundreds of their own men in the process, and they had essentially gained nothing. This was a serious blow to the South Vietnamese, and it proved that they couldn't win the war without the help of the United States. A few months later, in May of 1968, the U.S. launched Operation Secretariat, an offensive designed to once and for all wipe out the Viet Cong. The operation was a huge failure. Not only did the U.S. fail to wipe out the Viet Cong, but they suffered nearly 3,000 casualties in the process. By this point, it was clear to everyone that this war was going terribly for America. Public opinion had completely turned against the war, and the U.S. government was desperately trying to find a way out. On October 26, 1969, President Johnson announced that he would not seek re-election in 1972, and his reasoning for doing so was pretty clear. Johnson had basically been the face of the Vietnam War, and it was widely believed that the American public would vote against any president who continued to support the war. So Johnson pulled out of the race, and Richard Nixon took his place. Nixon had campaigned on ending the war in Vietnam, and that's exactly what he did. By 1973, all U.S. soldiers had been removed from Vietnam, and the war was officially over. Now, following the withdrawal of American troops, South Vietnam continued to fight against the North with the help of the U.S. But ultimately, it was to no avail. In 1975, Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, fell to North Vietnamese forces, and the country was unified under the control of Ho Chi Minh, the leader of North Vietnam. Today, there are still a lot of questions surrounding the Vietnam War. For example, was it worth it for the United States to send 50,000 of their best and brightest to die in a war that wasn't even theirs? Or was it right for the U.S. to interfere in the first place? There are no easy answers to these questions, and that's why the war still continues to divide Americans today. Regardless of your personal feelings on the war, there's no denying that it was a pivotal event in modern history. The war divided the American public, caused massive social upheaval, and helped to usher in a new era of politics in the United States. But nonetheless, the Vietnam War is over, and we can only hope that the wounds it left behind continue to heal. As I said before, there are still a lot of questions surrounding the Vietnam War. A lot of people don't know much about it because our education system doesn't teach it very well. That's why I encourage you to check out this video next. It's a documentary that does an excellent job covering many of the unanswered questions surrounding this horrific war.